Okay, so we're very pleased to have James Berry presenting the webinar today. James is the Director of Training here at Business Forecast Systems, and he's worked with literally hundreds of clients, including Thermo Fisher Scientific, FedEx Ground Services, Arista Life Sciences, Irving Oil, and Honeywell, to just name a few. If you've worked with James, you know that he's very adept at teaching organizations both the ins and outs of business forecasting, as well as how to get the most out of their Forecast Pro software. So without any further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to James to present Embracing Forecast Uncertainty, Confidence Limits, Safety Stocks, and Order Quantities.
All right, thank you, Eric, and hello, everyone. Again, as Eric said, my name is James Berry, and what we're going to cover today in our workshop is to really look at data that's not very easy to forecast. So items that it's very hard to determine, next period or the next several periods, either because the data is very sparse, because the data is very low volume, because the data simply doesn't have a pattern, or perhaps the data is new. And what we're going to look at and explore are some techniques that can be utilized to try to improve your forecast for these types of products. So whether that's through the use of confidence limits and safety stock calculations, so we can maintain certain amounts of order quantity, which would be very useful for us. We can look at low volume data and how to try to deal with those types of items in terms of rounding or categorization, as well as the use of proportional allocation if we're doing certain types of parts that we need to do. All of these are different strategies that we're going to try to assess how do we actually produce something that we can utilize for planning purposes going forward when we have this very difficult type of data. We're going to use some real-world examples, and we're going to use Forecast Pro to show you some of these different examples as well. Okay, so with that said, let's start with our first topic, which will be confidence limits. Okay, so when we're talking about confidence limits, within Forecast Pro, there's actually two distinct types of confidence limits. There are point confidence limits and cumulative confidence limits. The point confidence limits give you an upper and lower bound around your forecast. Some people would call it a forecast range. And what this will do is at each point in the future, it will calculate what would be our range around our forecast and an upper and lower limit. A cumulative confidence limit, on the other hand, is simply an upper bound. And this upper bound is looking at not just my data at any one point in time, but it's taking into account the fact that my data is moving through time. So where I am this period was influenced by where I was the period before and will influence where I'm going to be the period after. We're going to take a look at these two in depth to try to understand the differences between the two different types of confidence limits. And we'll begin with the point confidence limits. An easy way to understand that, let's go ahead and open up an example in Forecast Pro. So here I've loaded onto the screen some historical data. We can see on the graph, here's my historical data in green. I have 3 years or 36 months of history, and I have my red line as my forecast going forward. I also have this blue line, this range around the data, that we would consider a point confidence limit. So at each point in the future, here you can see that I have my forecast for July is 229 units. The upper limit is 351, the lower is 107. A lot of people would ask, how do we actually come up with this range around the data? And to illustrate this, I've brought in our fitted values. This red line covering the historical data is what we would call a fitted value. It's how well the model fit the history. Here I'm using a very simple model, which is just a straight line model with an equation of y equals mx plus b. And I'm not doing a very good job of explaining the variation in the history. Now if we were to map and plot the difference between the fit and the actual over the course of the historical periods, we could create a kind of distribution. And in Forecast Pro, unless otherwise specified, we would assume a normal distribution or bell-shaped curve. So if I had taken those 32 gap periods and plotted them on an XY axis, I would come up with this distribution. Now depending upon the volatility of my data and depending upon how well the model explains the volatility in your data, this could be a very short and very wide curve, or it could be a very tall and very narrow curve. But once we've distributed this curve, we can take it and center it on the forecast. By centering it on the forecast, we make it the mean of the distribution. The mean of a distribution is the point most likely to occur. and the forecast is what we think is the most likely to actually happen. And once we've done that, we can then go out on the tails of this distribution to come up with an upper and lower limit. How this would work, if we can illustrate this with a little animation, is if we turned this, twisted it, that's how we would come up with our upper and lower bounds within the tool itself. Now here in Forecast Pro, when we see this, we actually come up with, you need to set your upper and lower limits to things that you can normally utilize and report upon. Here what we've done as our default in our example is we've set the upper limit to 97.5% and the lower limit to 2.5%, which is basically 2.5 standard deviations plus or minus the mean. What this means is that 97.5% of the time, assuming a normal distribution, based off the past volatility of your data, we would expect the forecast to come in at or below the upper limit. 2.5% of the time, we'd expect it to come at or below the lower limit, creating a range of 95% of the time, we'd expect it to fall in between. So going back to Forecast Pro, you can see that here, with our poor modeling, with using a very simple model, and our flat line, we have a very wide range around our forecast because we're not doing a very good job explaining the variation. If we were to come here and remove this and use a more appropriate model, you can see the fit gets much better. Now using this better model explaining more of the variation, the fit around the actual items becomes much tighter, and we can see that we've done a better job of explaining the variance of the data. So looking at this visually and graphically, it gives us a sense of how volatile is our data and how well is the model doing actually predicting the volatility of my data itself. And we can see it here illustrated. Now this is a very useful feature, and it's something that's utilized quite a bit, which can really help us with problem items. We can see that we have, if our item is very difficult to forecast or we're not doing a very good job, we're going to have a very wide range around it. Whereas if we're doing a better job, we would have a much tighter range around this data. Some people will often ask, well, that's great. Can we use these upper limits to do safety stock calculations? People would say, well, if I forecast here and I use the upper limit for the next 3 months, I'll be in stock 97.5% of the time, right? Wrong. A lot of people would say up here, oh, let's use this high upper limit, except if we planned at this upper limit, this is sort of the best case scenario. It's very rare you would come at that high limit up there. Most of the time you'd fall below that upper limit. And if I planned on that upper limit 3 months in a row, that'd be even more rare for us to actually have that kind of upper bound happen 3 months in a row. And if I did that, most likely I would have too much stock or too much inventory on hand. So while these point confidence limits are useful for giving us a range around our data, they're not so useful for safety stock for any kind of lead time. For that, we need to use the other type of confidence limit, the cumulative confidence limit. And let's discuss how that's actually done. You can think about this in terms of sort of basic ideas. If I walked into my warehouse and I pulled out a magic wand and I waved my magic wand around and I instantly filled my warehouse up with inventory, all the way to the rafters till I had no space. I didn't care about inventory costs. I didn't care about anything. Just do it and instantaneously, and I'd fill my warehouse with inventory. I'd be flush with inventory. And then I'd put my wand away and go home. And what would happen over time is that I would deplete that initial inventory. And so it would be going down until eventually I hit zero and I'm out of stock. At which point I'd take out my magic wand again and refill it. And I'd continue to do this over and over again, what's called a sawtooth pattern. The problem with this approach by itself is that if I have a lead time of any sort, I can't do this. If I wait until my inventory is zero, I'll run out of stock. If I had a lead time of, let's say, 3 months, I don't want to wait until I hit here at zero. I want to go back in time 3 months, 1, 2, 3, and find out what this point is, what people refer to as a reorder point. When my inventory falls to this level, I need to place an order, and in the time that order takes to come in, I'll deplete the remainder of my inventory. This can also be accomplished here in Forecast Pro. So if we go back to our item, here in our forecast report, we can actually see a safety stock calculation. I'm going to turn off the graph just to make a little bit more space. What you can see is we have 4 different columns. We have a lead time of all of the possible lead times. This is monthly data, so 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 month, all the way to 12 months. We'll focus on our 3-month example that we were just looking at. We have a column called DDLT, which stands for demand during lead time. This is simply the sum of the forecast. My forecast for next month is 255. My forecast for 3 months out, so month 1, 2, and 3, sums to 797 units. So the forecast predicts I'll sell 797 units over the next 3 months. Based off the past volatility of my data, and based off of how well I explained that, if I want to be in stock 97.5% of the time, I would need to carry an additional 151 units of inventory, just based off the past variation of my data. And if I were to add up these two numbers, 797 plus 151, gives me a grand total of 947 units. So my reorder point would be 947 units. So for an item like this, where the data is fairly smooth and we're doing a fairly decent job of explaining it, our safety stock is fairly low compared to our forecast. If we look at another example here, you can see that the data seems to be fairly stable, except there are big gaps in the fit. You can see here there's just been lots and lots of gaps between the fit, and especially here in the more recent periods, there's been lots of uncertainty with this data. And because of this growing uncertainty, this would mean I would need to carry a higher amount of safety stock. If we look at our 3-month example here, you can see that our forecast is for 66 units over the next 3 months. However, based off the volatility of my data and the uncertainty, we would need to carry an additional 69 units, more than the forecast itself. Added together, this would give us a reorder point of 135 units. And if you look at the data, you can see why. We've had these spikes here in April, and we were expecting one again in April, but it didn't happen. Instead, it came in May. There's all of this movement, and it was a very large spike, much larger than we would have expected. And so while we expect to only sell 66 units, we've had periods in time where we've sold very, very high amounts, just that single amount in a single period. So because of that, we would need to maintain a much larger inventory level to accommodate this kind of uncertainty. Now, I will preface this by saying that there is no one right way or wrong way to do safety stocks. What I've showed you here is what's illustrated in Forecast Pro using statistical analysis. I've seen lots of companies that use very simple methods, for instance, doing min-maxes, to people who are doing very complicated formulas where they basically assign a value to items based off of its importance to the company, its material costs, its storage cost, the cost of a lost sale, as well as minimum order quantities. And all of these get fed into a very large calculation to determine the amount of stock to hold. Many large-scale planning systems, MRP systems, things of those sorts, they actually usually don't calculate safety stock on their own. They have a field for it, but this is also done as part of the implementation, is the setup of the calculation of these numbers. So what Forecast Pro here is providing is just one sample of types of safety stock, but the concept is very important. And how do I actually generate extra amounts of inventory that I might want to carry in order to basically measure uncertainty, which is what we're discussing today in our session here. Okay, so these will come up again and again in terms of the concepts of the confidence limits and this entire concept of I have data, it is very difficult to forecast, and how much extra do I need to have in order to deal with that kind of piece. Okay, so with that said, we're going to move on to where is the type of data where this will really come into play. So we've talked about safety stock, we've talked about confidence limits, we've talked about spread, and we've also mentioned that there's different types of data where this will become vitally important. The most common that you will see will be with low volume data. Okay? There's really two types of low volume data when you want to think about it. There's actually small volumes that are consistent. So I just sell this item in small quantities, and these small quantities, though, are very consistent throughout my historical data. And then there is intermittent data. This is data that has lots and lots of zeros in it, meaning that I have sales, but they're scattered sporadically, and there are large spans of time where I don't have any sales. A lot of times these would be classified as your C items when you look at your data, and typically they will make up the bulk of your series. So when we look at this type of data, we would say, you know, we have all of this low volume data here, but it's actually the items that were looked at the least, even though they consist of the most series. You know, a Pareto analysis would say that 80% of our volume, 80% of our series only constitutes 20% of our total volume. And so these tend to be the sort of forgotten items. They make up the bulk of your series, but they're very difficult to forecast and they tend to not get a ton of attention. And more importantly, because they are of such small volumes, it's typically very difficult to actually generate a forecast from them, either because they have very intermittent demand, it's very sparse, or because it's such a small amount of volume, finding any kind of buying patterns is difficult. And a lot of times what happens is we end up with a flat line forecast for these types of items. And if it's one thing that I've heard quite a bit, it's that people don't like flat line forecasts. You know, what we technically call, they want the line to wiggle. My history wiggles, why doesn't my forecast wiggle? Okay? And so that can be very difficult if I can't identify patterns. And so what we want to do is we want to sort of take this type of data and we want to be able to utilize this type of stocking level to look at it and hopefully come up with a better forecast that we can predict based off of it. Okay? So if we look at this, I'm going to go to another example here of our auto parts data, and here's an example of our rounding data that we've had that can be sometimes difficult. I'm sorry, our intermittent data that can be difficult for us to forecast. You can see here that the data, again, it's monthly data. This is still parts of our auto parts example, so it does come from an auto parts company. And you can see that there are sales, but only sporadically over the course of the 3 years. And what this has produced is a flatline forecast. As we just discussed, it also produces a very large range around our data of both the confidence limits here, the point confidence limits that we can see, as well as if we look down here at our cumulative confidence limits, you can see it has a very, very large safety stock calculation, just as we would expect. So using the safety stock would be one technique that we could utilize for this type of data. It's very common. I see it all the time. Another option that you can use is something that we have introduced into Forecast Per Track version 4, which is an ability to round your data. Okay? As you can see here, the forecast is a flat line of 0.59 units per month. Now obviously as a person you can't actually build 0.59 of a unit of something. So we would need this to be some sort of whole number. And if we rounded it just as a simple whole number, we could do that here. We can change this to just round to whole numbers, and then we'd sell 1 every month. And that may be a little bit too aggressive because we're rounding up and now we're selling 1 a month, even though we very rarely sell more than a couple a year. So that may be one possibility, and it's something that I've seen a lot of customers do. But we thought we could improve this rounding, and so we've added it as something that we can do in Forecast Pro. What we're going to do is what's called a cumulative rounding. And I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the overrides and bring up how we do this in the new version of the software. We've added these new system rows where we can actually show these rounded integer forecasts. I'm going to turn on the final row, and I'm going to check this off just to show you what it would look like. What this is going to do is it's going to create a new row in our data. And this row is going to show us a rounded number. It's going to be an accumulation of your forecast. If we look at our forecast for the next 12 months, this probably is a fairly decent forecast where it's predicting we're going to sell about a little over 7 units in the entire year. And that probably makes sense. And so instead of putting a flat value for each period going forward, what we could do is we could round the data so that it can be going to whole number units, so that our sum would still be about 7 or 8 units over the course of the year, but it won't be a single flat line, and it will be in whole numbers. So what we've done here is we can also, in the new version, if we look at this data, you'll notice that the sales in the past, this was of 2 units, this was of 6, this was of 2, this was of 6, and this was of 4. What this is saying is basically people only order in a minimum quantity of 2 units at a time. We could never even sell 1. We can't sell 0.59 units. That would just be something we can't even produce. But we also would never sell 1 unit. We would always sell 2 units at a time. That's just how this item was sold. And so what we've done here is we've rounded to the nearest 2 units. We've started with the accumulation in the history. And so what's happened is here in July it's 0. In August it's 2. And then what we do is we accumulate until we would round up to the next 2. So we'd add another 0.59, 0.59, 0.59, 0.59. Those added together would cross our 2 threshold and get us to 2. And 0.59 with some left over gets us to 2, and so on. So that the sum of our forecast is now 8 over the course of 12 months, which would be the rounded number of our 7.12 going forward. So over the course of the 12 months, we're going to say we're going to consume the same amount of quantity, but instead of being a flat line of a decimal, we've rounded it to whole numbers, and we've rounded it using a minimum order quantity that we've sent. Here in the graph, we can actually see this number if we go ahead and turn it on. And you can see the forecast is different. Let me turn off the confidence limits to make this a little easier to see. And you can see our 2 forecasts. We have our flat line forecast in red, and we have our new rounded cumulative forecast here in blue, which will utilize how we can actually round the data. If we wanted to look at one that was rounded just to the nearest whole number, we can do that too. Here's another example. Here's one, again, 0.4 units every month, which would not be correct. This one we sell in just quantities of 1, so we just round it to 1. And so every time we would accumulate here, the accumulated forecast is over 5. Here, accumulated forecast is 5. So that the accumulated forecast is the same, but we're getting whole number forecasts. And more importantly, when explaining to some people, they're very happy because the line wiggles. People like that. We could see another example here of where we've raised the minimum order quantity. Here's an item, again, very sporadic. It has lots of zeros in it. And our flatline forecast was of 3.8 units per month. However, now with our new integer forecast, we can round it to 10. So whenever we reach 10 units per month, we round up, and every other period we round to 0. And so our total forecast was about 45 units here. Here it's 50 because we're rounding up to the tens, but that's how we could get our cumulative forecast going forward. And this can be very beneficial to a lot of folks because what they're looking for is, I need a whole number forecast. And I don't want the same number each month going forward. This can try to accommodate some of these minimum order quantities that you may have. It can also accommodate this sort of sporadic data, and a lot of our folks have been very happy with it. A couple of things that this does not do, for instance, it does not necessarily get the timing correct, though. This is one of the difficulties in this type of data. These sporadic items are very random. So if we go to our first item, you can see that these are very sporadic, and it's random ordering that comes in. This is at a very consistent kind of basis going forward. So I don't know if we're going to really sell our 2 in August, but at least we're getting a whole number forecast on a cumulative basis that's very good. It's the timing of this that's very, very difficult, since if the data doesn't have any pattern to it, getting the timing correct would be very, very difficult. But at least we're getting the quantities correct going forward from here. The other thing that some people will note is it's not a consistent always a number and then the same number of periods in between. It's an accumulated total that is rounding. And in Forecast Pro, you actually have the ability to say, when does this begin to round? Whether it starts accumulating in the history, so we start the accumulation here when the data begins, or when the forecast begins. We start when the history begins, because if you did it when the forecast began, it would basically guarantee that there would be a low number the first month going out, because we need to start the accumulation, and that can lead to some biases with our data. But this was a new feature that's been introduced into Track version 4, and it's something that's going to be very, very useful for some of this low volume data that people are looking at. So we've looked at 2 things up until this point. We've looked at confidence limits, so producing safety stocks for some of these low volumes instead of a direct forecast. We've also looked at how can we round some of these data to eliminate some of these flat line forecasts, so at least we're getting whole number forecasts coming out of our low volume items. Our final piece that we'll be looking at here for this kind of low volume data would be categorization. And this is something that I highly recommend for a lot of our clients. When our average users have between 5 and 25,000 series, or folks who have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of series that they're responsible for, there's a limited amount of resources that can go around. And so these kinds of techniques of looking at, do I have confidence limits? Do I have safety stocks? Do I have these rounded integer forecasts? I want to categorize my data and maybe take certain approaches for certain types of items, what I would usually call rule-based forecasting. If I could find some way of grouping some items, so for instance, we've already talked about, do I have ABC classification, so that my C items I'll treat differently than I would my A items? Do I have make to order versus make to stock? Because if I have to stock items, I might try different stocking approaches, and something that's made to order, I may forecast that at a very different value. Am I doing high volume versus low volume? Am I doing finished goods versus spare parts? The parts you may want to have a stocking level, so because they're universal and they're used, versus a finished good, I may need to use this whole number rounding to deal with that. And so understanding your data, coming up with these kinds of rules, is one of the real sort of strong points for how do I actually approach this kind of data in real-world fashion. How do I start using some of these approaches that we've discussed to deal with this kind of low-volume data so that I can actually generate a decent expected demand going forward, or at least some information about expected demand going forward. Okay? So, with that said, we're going to move on to the third part of our topic in terms of how we deal with this kind of sporadic, difficult-to-do data, and that will be proportional allocation. Currently in Forecast Pro, we have different ways of generating forecasts. For those of you who have used the software, you know that there's what the program does called bottom-up, which is we'll forecast your items and just add up those forecasts to generate aggregate group totals. And in the current version, we also have a top-down approach, which is to say if I could group together, if I could categorize and group a certain type of data that has a certain demand pattern, even if the items themselves are very short, very noisy, very low volume, I could actually forecast at a group aggregate level and then push that forecast down. It's an approach that can be used with quite a bit of success to allow me to take data that's very hard to forecast with a lot of variation in it and allow me to smooth it out, to work at that high aggregate level where I have higher volume, longer, more complete history, and I can produce a better, more accurate forecast. And up until this point, we had a top-down allocation to apply that. In the new version of the software, we also have a new custom allocation that can also be useful for certain of you where you have a certain amount of products that you want to distribute, and you want to control the amount of distribution. So let's look at a very simple explanation for how this would work. So we've talked about this before in previous webinars, but it'll be important to sort of highlight, which is, let's say I have a very simple group, which we would call cans. And within it, it has two SKUs, 6-packs and 12-packs. And I say forecast next month. If we let a program just go, it would independently forecast each of these nodes. It would say generate a forecast for next month for 6-packs, and it would come up with a value of 70. This is what we've put down here. Forecast next month 12-packs, and it would come up with a forecast of 30. And then cans come up with a forecast for next month of 120. So I've generated this forecast, and it obviously doesn't reconcile. Now, if my 6-packs and 12-packs were low volume or they were sporadic items that were difficult to forecast, I may want to consider forecasting at the group total. Where I have higher volume, longer history, more structure, I could produce a better, more accurate forecast. And so I can do that by, in the current version of Forecast Pro, going top-down. And this top-down would say, lock this forecast of 120, and then based off of the initial forecasts, push this down proportionally to 6-packs and 12-packs. So 70 plus 30 is 100, so we're going to do 100%. So 70% of 120 is 84. 30% of 120 is 36. So we would adjust 6-packs to be 84, 12-packs to be 36, and they would sum to 120. And I'd be able to utilize this combined effort to try to eliminate some of this uncertainty that I have in the data at the low volumes. However, what if I actually know the proportional breakdown? What if I'm doing something where I want to assign a certain amount of proportion? Forecasting at the group level, that's very, very useful to me, but I want to control the proportions that are done here. So for instance, what if I wanted 6-packs and 12-packs to get an equal amount of the group total? That's very possible. So what we can do here is we can now assign and say, instead of letting the forecast determine the proportionality, let's go ahead and distribute it down using our own known proportions. And here we would just say 50-50. So this would get 60, this would get 60, and they would add up to 120. Let's see these two options in action in Forecast Pro. So here's a different data example. This data is real data. It comes from a shoe company where they actually sell different shoes. And what you're looking at here is a particular shoe. It's a SKU. It's just a particular style of shoe. And you can see here at the historical data, again, it's monthly. We have just over 4 years of history, and it's very stable. It's very high volume. We can see a forecast. Underneath this item is certain sizes. So you can see this is size 7, size 7.5. And at the low volumes, at the ends of these, at some of these, you can see that some of these are more popular, but a lot of the smaller sizes are very low volume, just like we're talking about, very sporadic, very difficult to track. So the type of data that we've been discussing throughout this webinar. And you can see it's generated flatline forecasts. Now we could have come up here and we have our two options. We could come in and we can actually set this as a top-down. We can say let's forecast at the group level where we have high consistent volume, complete history. We'll generate this forecast and proportionally push it down to the items underneath it. So to do that, we would simply right-click on the item and choose our top-down option. You'll see the forecast changes, and now these flat line forecasts are no longer flat because we're proportionally distributing the pattern down to it. Unfortunately, these low volume items are getting a very small percentage of the total, because some of these very high volume items are taking a much higher percentage of that total. Thus, the pattern is much more distinct here at these higher volume items. So we've improved the lower volume items. There's no longer flat lines, but we haven't improved it very much. This is still somewhat difficult because the pattern is just not there. We can see the pattern is very strong here, but because these are such small percentages, they don't get nearly enough of the percentage volume. Thus, the pattern isn't quite clear. So our new approach would be to come in here and do a custom allocation. So as you can see, I have all these different sizes, but if I had a size chart or a size breakdown, I could load that into the system and then allow me to actually take this forecast at the product level and break it down to the proportions that I choose. And that's exactly what I've done. I've gone ahead and loaded in a proportional breakdown here into Forecast Pro. This is in track version 4, and so we're now adding the ability to bring in this custom allocation definition that we're looking for here. So I have this custom allocation. It's going to allow me to do this. Okay? So with the custom allocation now loaded into Forecast Pro, what I can do is I can go over to this item. I can right-click on it, and instead of choosing the top-down like I did last time, I'm going to choose custom allocation. In this custom allocation, we'll put on a different modifier. You'll see the forecast will change. Again, it's maintaining the seasonality and the pattern that we want. But now when I go to these lower volume items, you can see that it's actually applying the pattern to it at the percentages that I told it to. Some of it may even be a bit ahead of some of these historical data. Why? Well, because these items have been so poorly forecast in the past that actually they were having stockouts and supply issues, but this is what the true demand would look like if we could keep it in stock. So we have this kind of pattern that's much more distinct if I can set up my own pattern and push it down. So I can control the allocation. And so that's how we can really maintain the kind of forecast that we're producing. So this would allow us to say, I have all of these items that are difficult to forecast, but what if I could take the pattern from something and then proportionally push it down to the items that I know based off of this? And I can do it either through top-down, where the forecast volume will take into account the pattern proportionality, or I can load in my own proportionality that I would like to use so that I can come into the data and generate a forecast that way. So it's one of these situations here where we have new options and alternatives to actually go through what we've been looking at. So to recap what we've seen today, I'm going to go back to my initial slides here, and I want to start talking about some of the key things that we've looked at so far. So we looked at confidence limits. These can be used throughout the application on high volume, low volume, but any items that I have a certain amount of uncertainty. I want to provide a certain amount of safety stock, a certain amount of buffer around my data, whether that's a confidence limit to give you a sense of range of where you think your forecast will come in, or whether I actually need to do some sort of stocking limit and coming through here. So we have this kind of ability to generate these different types of ranges around our data that can help us try to deal with some of this volatility, this uncertainty in our own historical data. We talked about the largest culprit of this kind of data, which is low volume data. Okay, so when I have either small volumes or intermittent data, this is really going to be the culprit. And a lot of these items I would need to use my safety stock or my confidence limits to produce. We also showed how we could do either rounding to whole numbers, which especially with low volume data becomes critically important, or we can talk about categorization, where we want to do certain A items versus C items. Do we want to do make to order versus make to stock? And how do we do those kinds of things? And then finally, we talked about proportional allocation. What if I could take this problem data and group it together in some way, and then forecast at a higher group aggregate level, where I have higher volume, more structure, an easier forecasting possibility, and then push that forecast down to these lower level items that have lower volume. And that proportionality can be dictated by Forecast Pro using a top-down approach, or by bringing in a custom allocation from an external source. So what we've tried to touch upon here is the fact that a lot of the data you will see will be this kind of difficult to forecast. It's the easy stuff is usually taken care of through software. It's the hard stuff. It's the things that don't have patterns. It's things that have short history, that have very low volume, that have sporadic sales, that are really the crux of what a problem of forecasting is. They tend to make up the bulk of your series, but they also tend to be the most difficult to forecast. And so what we've tried to highlight here are some techniques and some tips that can hopefully help you when generating a forecast for these specific items. Okay? So that wraps up sort of the basic part of this. I do have a few housekeeping things I would like to go over with some folks, if that's okay, and then we will take your questions. All right. So first thing I would like to point out is that this webinar series is done once a quarter, so we do it 4 times a year. Our next webinar will be considerations of effectively forecasting a product hierarchy. We touched upon a few of these key topics today, so it'll be a great follow-up session on that, in the sense that they'll talk about hierarchy setup, how do you utilize that in more detail. It will be on July 23rd at the same time as this webinar, which is 1:30 U.S. time, East Coast. It'll be presented by my moderator here, Eric Stellwagen, who's been helping me today. He will be presenting that. You can go to forecastpro.com right now to sign up for that. You can see and have a link from our website to actually go and sign and register. And as always, it is free, just like this webinar. As I am a software trainer for Forecast Pro, you can tell I'm pretty Forecast Pro centric in my my webinars. Anything that we did today is just some sample data that's coming in the system. We did use Forecast Pro Track version 4, which is our latest version of the software that we're preparing to release shortly, hopefully. If you have any questions about Forecast Pro or would like to see a demo of either the software itself or the new version of the software, please contact in our website and go ahead and try to request a web demo. We do these often. So to show you all the great functionality that's available in the software. If you have the software, good for you, and you need some training or some help using the software, I am the director of training here, and that's one of my primary roles. And I'm always happy to touch base with users who need help either with straight direct training or any kind of product consulting. So you can always get in touch with me either through Forecast Pro's website. We also do offer other types of educational events beyond the webinar and the training. We do have a seminar coming up as well, going to be a live user conference. It will be held here in Boston, September 29th and the 30th. There will be a pre-conference workshop on the 28th. We have doing this for the first time in many years, so we actively encourage any of our Forecast Pro users, if you want to come and meet other users and learn about the software in depth and have a great sort of event, we're hosting this. Again, it will be at the end of September, the 29th and 30th, with a pre-conference day on Monday the 28th. So please let us know how that goes. And so other than that, that's sort of my logistics. So at this point, I think I'm going to open it up to questions. If you have any questions, please type them in at this point. Eric has been taking your questions throughout the webinar, so I'm happy to answer them as well. As he mentioned, we will try to answer as many of the questions as possible here. If we don't get to your questions, don't worry. We will definitely follow up with you via email to answer any unresolved questions that people have about this type of data and these topics that we covered today. So, Eric.
Okay, thank you, James. We have some questions that have come in, and I'll feed you a few. The first one is, what is the role of the lower confidence limit? And also, does it impact the safety stock calculation?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. As we saw in our samples, the point confidence limits produce an upper and lower bound. Okay? They do not affect the safety stock. The safety stock is simply an upper bound. It's a maximum quantity to hold to meet some sort of demand. So the lower confidence limits do not affect the actual safety stock, which, as we said, is a cumulative confidence limit. The point confidence limit is basically, as we discussed, I want to show a range around my data of a high and low. You know, a lot of people always sort of say plus minus this amount. And what we've had here was sort of our 95% range. So the upper and lower bound create a 95% range around our forecast points that will show us here's our maximum that we think is possible and a minimum that we think is possible. Again, this is just based off the variation of your historical data as well as how well the model actually explained that historical data. But the lower confidence limit is there to give you a bottom level, but it does not affect the safety stock, which is a different calculation, a cumulative confidence limit.
Okay, thank you. We have another one here about the rounding. So the question is, how was the rounding quantity assigned to the different items in your example? Is it a user setting, or is it something that is calculated automatically?
Okay, so that's a good question. We did sort of breeze over some of the details on this. If we were to look at our item here, the rounding is using the default. So within our new rounding feature here in our system rows section, what you can see is when we bring up our system rows, we actually can show what are we rounding. We can round the statistical forecast, we can round the final forecast. We can also set a default value from which it will round. The program defaults to 1, so that if you don't provide it with any sort of number, it will round to the nearest whole number. However, if you do provide it, which I have done here in our sample, you can set it to something else. For instance, I loaded in the rounding factor of 10. So instead of using the default, which is 1, I loaded in and said, move this into order quantities of 10. And it's just an accumulation. Because I've started with the historical data, we just start accumulating and accumulating and accumulating until we eventually get to 10, at which point we round again, and then we get to 10, and then we round again. So the 1 is the easier one to sort of understand. The first is 0.4. The accumulation of this 2 is 0.8, which rounds to 1. Then what we do is we go here. The accumulation for the next one to here is 0.18, so we go here. Now we hit 1.76. That gets us another one. And then we accumulate to here. That gets us to 2.6, which is over 2.5, and it rounds up again. And so you can see it's almost always 1, except for here we didn't quite get over the 4.4 threshold. That's why it's still 0 in April. We get over 4.5, which rounds us up to 5, which is our next 1 increment. So it's an accumulation of the forecast. If you don't load anything in, you can use the default, which is in Forecast Pro, which would be rounding to 1, or you could set that to whatever you want. Or you can load this information in externally on an item-by-item basis, saying, what do I want to round it to?
Okay, thank you. Next question here. Do you have any recommendations as to how to categorize different items in terms of setting specific service levels? Are there any rules of thumb?
Okay, so that's a good question. So we discussed how we may want to try to categorize our data and take different approaches. So, there's lots of different ways. Some of the common ones that I've seen, some people have make-to-order versus make-to-stock. And a lot of what people will do for a rule for that would say, okay, all of my make-to-order items, we set the forecast value to 0, especially if we're doing a finished good. Whereas the make-to-stock, they take different approaches for that. There's also lead time specific is a very common one that you'll see. So items that have very short lead times, they tend to hold more inventory. Whereas there's items that have extremely long lead times, they tend to not hold as much inventory. So they tend to set the forecast much lower, and they take a different approach for that. The reason being they have a longer time to produce the product, so it's easier to get the actual pieces to build it, so they hold fewer in inventory. The other is cost, and that's one of the biggest things that I've seen. You know, if you have two items that each sold 1 unit last month, and one was a washer that cost 0.4 of a cent, comes in a box of 100, they just keep huge amounts of inventory of that, so they don't really bother with the details. But if my 1 unit sale was a jet engine that costs $60 million, requires a custom humidified storage facility for it, they take a very different approach. And so the cost of the company, both the cost of the item as well as the cost of storage, come into play when categorizing it. Those are really the major things that I see, how people try to approach these. And if you can categorize those types of data so that, okay, the small cost, small inventory holding ones, we're just going to let an automatic system go. Whereas these large, high-cost ones, those may have more hand interaction with these types of forecasts. And so the more you can categorize the data, the more you can parse it, the better off you're going to be. In a lot of ways, what people will do in Forecast Pro is they will bring in filters. So you can see, for instance, here, I have a filter. I have an ABC classification. I also have a salesperson classification. But I could have my make-to-order versus make-to-stock, or I could have high importance, low importance, high cost, low cost. And based off of those filters, I can actually go and apply different model settings to those groups of items that I've brought into Forecast Pro. Okay.
Okay, James, we'll take one more question here. Once we have hit our reorder point, what method would you suggest to calculate the new order quantity?
Okay, so that's a good question. A lot of what I showed for the reorder point is more theoretical, and it's sort of looked at it as if it was a one-time thing. But obviously, you know, you're setting minimum order quantities and reorder points on an ongoing basis. So your inventory is constantly in flux based off of what your inventory is. It's also in flux based off of how much you have in process. So that's usually something that's done, you know, outside of a system like Forecast Pro. If you had an MRP system or an inventory control system, those are certain key elements that go into those kinds of calculations. And so what they would normally do is you would set some sort of reorder point that would trigger the reorder, and that's how the supply would come in. And that's usually based off of inventory and certain key settings you set in your inventory holding costs in your planning system. So, and it's also done on an ongoing basis, so it's a bit more of a complicated look. You know, we tried to simplify it here for the demonstration, but it's a more complicated sort of fluid situation. The one key thing to always think about with any of these, whether it's safety stock or minimum order quantities, is that it is always something that you want to monitor to make sure that you're hitting that kind of, you know, inventory level, that stocking level, that in-stock level. Because if I'm setting this to 97.5%, am I actually hitting that, or do I have too much or too little inventory? So you always want to be tracking that and making tweaks to try to improve it. Okay. Okay. So it looks like those are our questions here. We are running low on time. So I would like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. I would like to thank Eric here for helping me out and taking some of our questions. Again, if we didn't get to your question this time, please don't worry. We will email you back with any responses to that. And with that, I would say thank you again for participating, and I hope to see you at our next webinar in July.